You've got a great idea for a small business, but you just can't get it off the ground. You want to be your own boss, set your own hours. Well, new year means new opportunities, and Shopify's got you covered to help get your venture off the ground. Shopify makes it easy to manage your growing business. You can get your store up and running easily with thousands of customizable templates. And they help with the details like shipping, taxes, and payments from one single dashboard. Don't kick yourself next holiday season when your 2025 resolution list looks the same as it does today. Make it happen with Shopify. Established in 2025 has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to start selling with Shopify today. Shopify.com/income.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. We all hear stories from time to time about a long hidden letter from a famous historical figure being discovered in someone's attic, or an object that belonged to a notable figure of the past being put up for auction. But have you ever wondered who actually verified that these rare artifacts are in fact the real deal? That's where my special guest for today comes in. Nathan Raab is the nation's leading dealer in important historical documents. As the president of the Raab Collection, he has advised the relatives of famous historical figures, including those of Dwight Eisenhower, Thomas Jefferson, and Ronald Reagan, as well as lifelong collectors and their families as they sell their treasures. He has helped important historical discoveries find homes in major institutions, including the Smithsonian, the National Constitution Center, the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Museum and Library, and many more. He began his career writing with the Associated Press in the Rome Bureau before working for several members of Congress on policy and communications issues. In this episode, we talk about his book, The Hunt for History, On the Trail of the World's Lost Treasures, from the letters of Lincoln, Churchill, and Einstein to the secret recordings on board JFK's Air Force One. I cannot thank Nate enough for his time and the insight that he provided about his work and some of the historical documents and artifacts he has discovered over the years. Thanks as well to Rebecca Berry for reaching out and working to set up this conversation. Without further ado, after this brief message, let's get to my discussion with Nate.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon. Sometimes the most painful part of getting sick is the getting better part. Waiting on hold for an appointment, sitting in crowded waiting rooms, standing in line at the pharmacy, that's painful. Amazon One Medical and Amazon Pharmacy remove those painful parts of getting better with things like 24/7 virtual visits and prescriptions delivered to your door. Thanks to Amazon Pharmacy and Amazon One Medical, healthcare just got less painful.
All right, so Nate, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. Just to get us started, I was wondering if you would mind sharing with the audience a little about the Raab Collection and what you do.
The Raab Collection is a historical document firm. We buy, sell, discover, seek out, research important documents from American, European, Asian past, and we find them new homes, whether they're institutions, libraries, archives, or, as is the case for the most part, private collections. And we've been doing that now. I'm the second generation. My father started the business in 1989 when I was in middle school.
Well, and it was fascinating to hear about your personal story with this and the fact that it is a family business. So your book, it was just fascinating to hear this personal family story in it. And I think that's one thing that you really get to in your work is that these are objects, but they're also very personal.
Yeah, I mean, the personal, the emotional side is what separates them from, being what they really are. Their component parts are pen and or ink and paper, which on their own are worth fractions of a penny. But because they are what they are, they symbolize something bigger and more meaningful. And that symbolism is somewhat different for each person, which is why one person might look for original documents signed by George Washington. Someone else might look for Susan B. Anthony. The details may change, but the premise is the same. As far as it being a family operation, yeah, I mean, when I was done writing the book, I was a little bit surprised at how much of sort of a personal family journey it ended up feeling like. There are photos of me in there as a, gosh, I think I might have been a 5-year-old. But it was and is a family business. My dad still works in the business, and we speak every day.
I love that. I love that it is something that is personal to you. And also, I think that's one of the things that really runs through your book is that the value of these historical documents and objects is about more than just the signature or the fact that it was owned by a particular person, but it's really also about the context of the piece and how it emotionally affects folks. And so I was wondering if you would please share some with us about your journey to learn how to recognize the value of these historical documents.
Well, there's no school that you can go to learn this. There really isn't. It's really kind of an old school apprenticeship. So you're taught by someone else who's engaged in the enterprise, but there aren't a series of classes that you could take that would really train you. I mean, I think it was probably 8 to 10 years before I felt comfortable going out on my own, buying these things, which are very expensive, and not feel a concern that, was I messing up? Were they not authentic? Without my sort of dad looking over my shoulder. That takes a lot of time because you're dealing with, a mistake can be quite costly. You buy something that you think is authentic and it turns out not to be, and you might be out tens of thousands of dollars. That's not a mistake I really wanted to make. I guess it's at its base, it's like any other skill, the ability to do it well and consistently well, and really always well, because you can never make a mistake in this particular area, it's just repetition. I was playing softball earlier today with my daughter and working on pitching. And like I was telling her, the people who are really good, what you don't see is you don't see the long hours, the, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours over the course of years, perfecting a skill. And this is really not much different.
And it really is something that is practice makes perfect. You never know when you're going to get to that point, but when you do, you just kind of know you're there. It's okay. And it's just, it's fascinating to think about it from a historical context. And speaking as somebody who has studied history for a long time, I've had my periods of the imposter syndrome for a while. And then you just get to this point, I really do know this stuff. And so that's something that comes across in your book and is just so fascinating.
Yeah, I never thought of the imposter syndrome thing, but there's probably something to that. I can't pinpoint a day or even a season where I felt like, oh, I got this now. I just kind of woke up and looking back, I was like, oh, I've been doing this. So, at this point, I haven't worked. My dad doesn't do any of the traveling and hasn't in a long stretch, or most of it. I suppose he does some of it, but a lot of these trips I'm out there on my own, and I can't remember when I actually started doing that. It's certainly been a long time, but yeah, in terms of the imposter syndrome, it has occurred to me that I have a very rare particular skill that it takes decades to acquire.
Yes, and as somebody who got my love of history from my mom, I completely understand. It's amazing how those things cross generations.
Yeah, no, it's a gift to be able to work with my dad, and I wouldn't have learned half of what I've learned, or I wouldn't have learned a quarter of what I learned without him guiding me along the way. So I was fortunate.
Absolutely. Well, and I've got to take a personal tangent because I am a bit of a Harrison fanatic, as our listeners well know. So I couldn't resist asking you to share with our listeners about the Congressional Gold Medal that was awarded to Harrison that you ended up finding, and in particular, how you were able to certify its authenticity was quite fascinating. So just wonder if you could share a little bit about that with us.
Yeah, so we bought the Congressional Gold Medal that was awarded to William Henry Harrison for his services in the War of 1812. He was his military service before his very brief presidential service. And we bought it from the Harrison descendants. So the provenance was about as good as it can get. I mean, I guess it was literally as good as it could get. The question then occurred to us, could this be a later reproduction? Could it be a copy done by the family, years before the current era? And ruling that out involved research into the known size of the metal, the known look of the metal, and the designs on both sides, the recto and the verso. And then it came down to the composition of the metal itself. And to do that, we ended up at the Smithsonian, where they had a machine which, I may get the science wrong, but as I recall, bounced electrons into or onto the metal surface to determine the metal composition. They also had another congressional gold medal from about 10 years earlier, as I recall. So what we were able to do is using that machine, we were able to determine that the metal was consistent with a metal of that era, and that it was not a later reproduction, but in fact was the real deal. So it was a long, exciting journey. I guess I've just given it away for those of your listeners who have not read the book yet. Newsflash, it was authentic.
Well, and we won't hold you to the science. This is not a science podcast. So
it's in the book. It's the machine that was used is in the book. Some kind of spectrometer, I think is the term, but don't hold me to that. But I guess the whatever they sent towards the metal travels at different speeds or emits at different wavelengths depending on what it's bouncing off. But yeah, my dad did not teach me science, so he that was not part of the apprenticeship.
That's why we bring in experts to be able to handle the science stuff when we need to.
Yeah, that was a very exciting find, and somewhat different than what we normally have in that it wasn't a document. Objects can present their own complications with authenticating them. And so pulling together the various elements, what it is, the composition of it, the provenance, the dimensions, we had to look to different sources for to check each one of those boxes. And they all had to line up for us to feel comfortable saying, this is what this is. And then charging the requisite amount, which was, as I recall, was $250,000, give or take.
Wow. Well, and that's one thing that I do recommend to our listeners. The book is filled with all of these mysteries. And as somebody who just loves mysteries and how you go about solving them and trying to really prove that these documents or objects are authentic is just fascinating. And you mentioned a partnership with the Smithsonian in that instance. And that was one thing that was interesting as I went along and was reading your book, was this partnership with other institutions that you've had. Like you mentioned, while you were searching the Washington survey, that you consulted with a former curator at Mount Vernon. So, Nate, I was wondering if you would mind talking more about how you partner with other institutions in the course of your work.
Well, we're all in similar ecosystems. We handle material that is of interest to them, whether they want the information for research purposes, or whether, as sometimes happens, they want to buy what we have, because institutions do buy from us. It's a mutually beneficial relationship in the sense that they can really aid us in our research and our understanding of some elements of what we have. I was just today going back and forth with the director at Caltech of the papers projects of Albert Einstein, because I'm looking to acquire an Albert Einstein document from 1920. And she was giving me a lot of really interesting background on the document itself. They have, we're generalists, but they're specialists. So they have a depth of information that in an area that we might not readily have available. And at the same time, they are interested in what we have because we're on the front lines of discovery. If someone has something that maybe was in their family, we may be the first ones to see it because, we're paying for it. So if somebody has this piece and they no longer want it, maybe the next generation doesn't want it, their first stop may be to us. And so if that's, like with this Einstein piece, this woman had never seen anything like it. I'm researching another piece right now, a series of telegrams from Sherman to his generals right before the March to the Sea, a battle that occurred in Alatoona, Georgia, and then, subsequently, I think there was an effort to sort of go into North Carolina. It's a series of telegrams. We bought it directly from the descendants. No one's ever seen it before. So, it's the partnerships is really, I would call it really an information sharing agreement for the most part. There are circumstances where it's more of a concrete partnership, but we're very grateful for the work that they do and the information they have. And in return, we try and share as much as we can.
Well, and I think that's one thing that comes across in your book is that these partnerships are beneficial, not just for your business, but also the institutions, because as our listeners can learn more about in your book, in the chapter about the Washington Survey, sometimes you come across forgeries.
Yeah.
And ultimately, in that instance, it was determined that some historical institutions had inadvertently acquired forgeries, and your research helped to uncover some of that. And so I was just wanting to see, in your experience, does that happen often that these institutions just inadvertently end up with forgeries, or was that kind of a rare occurrence?
I think every institution has forgeries. Some of them were bought with the knowledge that they were forgeries. And some of them, I think that most are fairly savvy to the situation today. I think most of the pieces that are in these institutions that were forgeries were donated or acquired a very long time ago. But, there were very good forgers who were able to create their work to a level sufficient that they ended up in an institution. So the fact that they had one, Williamsburg is not a shock. I suppose what was amazing was to find the counter. I think we found 4 different versions of the document. So, to find that there were 2 forgeries and 2 authentic, that is unusual. And to be able to find images of all of them, I believe I illustrated them all. That is very uncommon because they all have to survive. I mean, think about, there's 4 different documents have to survive, and those are not modern forgeries. Those forgeries might be 100, 120, 150 years old. So for them all to survive to the, whatever the year was, 2017, is itself quite a feat.
Well, and especially, and like you said, that becomes part of the story is that somebody felt that these documents were important enough to forge. And that was fascinating to me that you brought in some of the history of the forgeries. It really speaks to the fact that the work that you do is not just uncovering, recent forgeries or recent misunderstandings or clarifications, but this in some ways goes back hundreds of years of folks who felt that these documents were important enough to copy and sell to folks.
Well, and it's not only forgeries, it's secretarial signatures, being able to identify those as well. I have one of William Henry Harrison in my folder of not authentic documents that people tried to sell us. I was able to acquire this one. I can't remember the circumstances. It's usually hard to acquire them. They're very interesting to have. I'd like to have more of them, but it's usually, somebody approaches you, let's say with a document signed by Lincoln, and they want several $1,000s for it, and you tell them it's a forgery. I'd like to buy it, but I'm only going to give you a few hundred. That's a tough pivot. I mean, most people can't successfully make that pivot.
Yeah, and it is one of those things, and especially like we talk a little bit in presidencies trying to understand kind of what the day-to-day apparatus was for presidents, but even in the early days, the amount of correspondence that they had and the fact that they had to have secretaries to help carry on this correspondence with so many people across the nation and around the world, you're going to end up with some of these documents that even though it may have somebody's signature, you see it really is their secretary.
Yeah, well, every land grant signed, after Andrew Jackson's first term almost every land grant is signed by a secretary. And so I would say several times a week, people try and sell us land grants signed by, William Howard Taft or, Andrew Johnson. Weirdly, I've seen a handful of like Abraham Lincoln and Polk, like a really small handful. And I kind of wonder why those, like, why did they choose to sign 0.01% of these land grants? On the surface, they're not special plots of land. Just seems, seems capricious. But they exist. You can occasionally find a post Andrew Jackson land grant.
Interesting.
I don't know why.
And it really speaks to, that's a line of study for somebody out there if you're interested in trying to
Yeah.
figure out why these were, but it could be that there was some personal connection or whatever that we just don't understand right now.
Yeah, and we may never know.
Yeah.
And even if I knew, I'm not sure how much I'd care, how much the answer would interest me. I mean, it's sort of anecdotally interesting, but, if I had the information, what would I do with it? I don't know.
It seems like there may be a thesis in there somewhere for somebody.
Yeah.
Well, and going back to this idea that these documents are in some cases so personal. You mentioned how difficult it is for folks to sell documents or objects that are part of their family history, and that's understandable. Even when they start the process with you, that it can still be, you reach this point of, am I really doing this? What is going on? And so, Nate, I was wondering if you would just share how you approach these situations and what advice you give to folks who are considering parting with family heirlooms.
Well, I mean, don't part with something you don't want to part with. I'm not bullying anybody to sell me anything. If people don't want to, I don't want to part with my family heirlooms. If people don't want to part with theirs, they shouldn't. Most of the time, by the time they've reached me, they've made the decision. And it's more of an issue of, am I going to get enough money? It's a monetary decision. It is, I'm willing to part with it if it's, if it's enough money. So that's not the conversation I typically have with people. It's typically, what would you pay for this? And that's a calculation that we have to do after a small amount of research and then thinking through, okay, well, what can I charge for it? Because at the end of the day, we have to charge more than we pay for it. That's how we make our money.
Absolutely.
But, there are people, the challenging element there is if there's more than one family member involved. Typically, if there's more than one family member involved, it won't end up being sold. It's just hard for everybody to get on the same page. It becomes a complex negotiation. Your sister now is involved and her son has an interest. And all of a sudden there's like not only different family members, but there's multiple generations worth. That's a family dynamic. And when that happens, our answer is, why don't you guys talk about it and get back to us if you decide you want to sell? My experience is that the more the possibility of selling and the number of family members involved at the same time, they work inversely. So you can't have, it's not like the more people who are in the boat, the more likely it's going to land on the shore. It's the opposite case here.
Absolutely. And it really speaks to, family dynamics can be quite interesting.
Yeah, well, that's certainly true.
But it is also fascinating, and especially you highlight some cases where, folks do make that decision and it becomes something, kind of letting go and moving forward. It's really interesting.
Yeah, a lot of people, if you've inherited this, you simply don't have the same connection to it as if you have bought it yourself. And listen, it's a truism that some generation chooses either to donate or sell. That generation might not have come yet, but it will come.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and it's interesting kind of turning the conversation a little bit because, of course, everyone hopes that what they have is valuable, but you also note those times that documents or objects are just not worth that much, or in some cases aren't authentic. And one of the things that you noted at the beginning of the book that just really stuck with me is you recounted how you had to tell Gerald Ford's nephew that his signed photograph of his uncle was in fact a reproduction. And so I was wanting to see, how do you approach breaking that type of news to folks?
Well, first of all, that's a good lesson that anything could be. You have to examine everything with fresh eyes. You can't just assume because he had it, it was authentic. How do I approach the bad news? Preferably not in person.
Yeah.
It's hard to look somebody in the eye. It sort of depends. I mean, some people take it well. There's a story in the book of a woman who was hoping to sell a George Washington letter and then pay for the education of her grandson, as I recall. And she wanted to come just show me in person. And I told her, that's really not necessary. Just send me an image and I can at least give you a sign. Well, yeah, we're heading in the right direction. because I don't meet 99.9% of my buyers or sellers. We're an international business. And so there's anything that we can do in person, we can do at a distance. But she wanted to drive down. She drove down from, I think it was Connecticut, and walked in the door, and, just immediately, it doesn't take me long. I mean, you can look at something and tell almost immediately in most cases, is this good or bad? And it was just like obviously not authentic. And I had to tell her, I'm sorry, this is not what you think it is. And I'm sorry. I mean, I'm empathetic. What can I say? I mean, I'm not I'm doing nobody any favors if I lie to her. So I guess my answer is I try to be as empathetic as possible, but you can't get around the fact that I'm giving pretty bad news.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's always tough because like you said, and that's one thing that I really came away from reading your book with, is that all of this, ultimately, it's personal. It's about the folks who crafted these historical documents that were, involved with these objects, but then also the present day, how we approach them and what we learn from them. And sometimes the lessons are that, we don't have something that is as valuable as we thought. And that can be a tough lesson to process.
Yeah. I mean, everything's personal on some level. This is a more concrete example, a more easily tangible example, but our lives are governed by emotions, feelings, our personal reactions. And this is an example. You can look around on people's walls and, learn a lot about, learn something about them.
Well, and it's interesting because that's another thing that I came away from your book with, is this idea, the detail that you go into in trying to understand these documents. And you really come across that you're trying to piece together a puzzle. And you don't assume anything from the beginning. You go ahead and take the information that you've got. You try and gather more information to reach a conclusion, to really piece this together.
Yeah.
And that really speaks to you.
That can be hard. I'm doing it right now with this telegraph book, going back and going between Sherman and his men and figuring out, well, actually they weren't telegraphs, because these men, he was somewhere else, and these men were holed up in this fort. They were like flag messages and torch messages, which is fascinating. It said copy of messages on the back. And I had to learn that copy of messages is a term of art in the telegraph community. It doesn't exactly mean what you think it means. It means the sort of official register of the incoming and outgoing messages that were kept by the telegraph operator himself, in this case, the message operator. And then, figuring out exactly what was going on and whose handwriting it was in and what purpose the document served and what was going on in the telegraphs. I mean, it was a very important set of communications. It's an exciting find. And the more I sort of dug into it, it's like a puzzle where you don't have all the pieces, and you're kind of going out and finding a piece, and you're adding that piece. And then all of a sudden and then you add another piece and it looks different than you thought it would look, but it's yet bigger and fuller. I mean, it's sort of like a growing puzzle where you don't ultimately know how the dimensions the puzzle is going to be.
And that's, I know for me, and I imagine some of our listeners as well, that's the fascinating thing to me about history, is just trying to piece together things that we don't necessarily know what all is going to come into play. And sometimes we end up on these completely different paths from what we expected, but it's also, we end up with a richer understanding of history and of documents and of the personal connection once we start that exploration process. And so, Nate, I was just wondering, what has been the most impactful presidential document that you've had come into your possession?
Well, the question's a loaded question, because impactful is a subjective designation. So what I would think would be impactful I would choose a different, if you and I were doing the same thing, we would choose different documents. I am particularly interested in people doing, in glimpses of people doing interesting things at a very young age. So you sort of capture them in a moment where they're going to be famous, and that big things are going to happen, but no one at the time knew. So like I find that stuff really, really cool. We have a document right now signed by Meriwether Lewis. It's not a presidential document, but I think he's like 25, 26, long before Jefferson sent him on the Lewis and Clark expedition. But he's just a young guy traveling out and about, doing his thing. He's out in the wilderness. He's learning the skills that he'll later use. But he was no one of great note, no one of, beyond no more or less destined for greatness than anyone else in that social circle, in that social and political military circle. So I find that stuff fascinating. The early documents of George Washington, of course, are beautiful and themselves fascinating. Most of those are the land surveys that he was doing when he was a young man. Sometimes you get receipts, but his handwriting and signature were different. So you don't often see that. Usually people retain the signature and the handwriting throughout most of their lives. So the younger signatures will look similar, if not identical, to the older signatures. There are changes, of course, and if you see enough of these documents, you can see the small changes, like in Lincoln's handwriting. But they're not like dramatically different. But Washington's signature changed dramatically.
Absolutely. And I will say that I did choose that language deliberately because, like you said, you can, if you look around at somebody's home, you look and see what's on the shelves, what's on the walls, you can get a sense of them. And I think that, and that's one thing that with your book, it comes across your personality and who you are. And likewise, I think your answer helps us to understand you a bit more of what's impactful to you. And that's,
Right.
and it's amazing because that's part of the wonderful thing about being a student of history is that we all find the things that we are really fascinated about. And once we have enough folks studying one aspect of history versus another, we end up with this rich tapestry together.
Well, and I'm glad you used the word impactful and not important, because the subjectivity is built into the language. I mean, I see that now. Important the more common question is, what's the best historical document you've ever carried? I can't answer that question. It's too hard to answer, but it's a routine question. I mean, and it's not an unreasonable one. It just doesn't have an easy answer.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And like I said, there's no easy answer to that. But in terms of understanding what our interests are, and again, I know that there are many of our listeners who probably wonder, why am I so fascinated about William Henry Harrison of all people? But it's something that I've been drawn to, and it's just a part of me, and it's fascinating. It's always interesting to see what people are really impacted by in their studies of history.
Yeah, I mean, we've had clients who collected purely James Monroe. We've had a client who collects nothing but James Garfield. People have their interests.
And so to turn it to you for a minute, I was just wanting to see what inspired you to write this book, and what do you feel is the key takeaway from it for your readers?
What inspired me to write the book? The book began not as a desire to write the book. I didn't set out to write a book. I set out to write, I should have put this in the book, in fact, but I didn't. I guess, I don't know. Second book. I set out to write a series of articles which would inform my customers how I got things, which is something that we've done internally, although not with as much frequency as I would like to do. And that's mostly my fault in that it's, the stories come fast and frequently. So, I have a whole 5 more books worth of stories since that book's been published. And there were many stories that didn't make it into that book. But we contacted an editor because I wanted somebody to help me do the work. And she thought that it had longer legs. So we contacted her agent, who was a fairly prominent agent out of, in New York City. And she just immediately jumped on it. We had a number of offers from publishers to publish the book. And before I knew it, we, had signed with Scribner, which is a division of Simon & Schuster, a very historic firm, which was meaningful to us. But it didn't, I suppose I never got to the point where I was thinking, oh, I'd really like to write a book. It just sort of started as articles. And before I know it, we had an agent. And then at that point, there was just nobody was asking me, do you want to write a book? It was like, well, we have an agent now. So, now we need to do the next step. It's, it kind of almost stumbled into the book. And your other question was, I don't remember the other.
So, what do you feel is the key takeaway from it for your readers?
You know, I think the key takeaway may be that I talk a lot towards the end of the book about how history, lives out in the present. And I think collectors really kind of do that without realizing they're doing it. They're in a sense reliving history in their minds through the things around them, literally in the present moment. So somebody who has documents from Queen Elizabeth the First through Albert Einstein is living close to half a millennium, and they're sitting on the walls right around them, and each one has their own significance. They're not just a sheet of paper. They're sort of living that history and receiving inspiration from people who have long since been dead, all at the same time in the present. So, if you imagine history as an accordion and you push the accordion in, I suppose you'd have to push the back of the accordion to the front because you can't pull the future into the present. But to keep the metaphor accurate for those metaphor accurate people out there, if you had an accordion and you pushed one side all the way, you push the past into the present. That's how I see it, and how that can be useful and really enrich people's lives, as these things can, is that they have the power to inspire and power to give you context, perspective, inspiration. And that's a special part of our job, because we get to give that to people. We get to see their excitement when they have something that really is meaningful, and we get to experience it ourselves. We experience it in a little bit of a different way. These things they don't live with us forever, but the excitement of opening something that no one's ever seen, no one's touched, in a sense, that's history arriving in the present. So, maybe this is just because I was dealing with an Einstein document, but I think there's certainly an objective way to measure time, but in reality, time is a much more fluid, moldable concept, because we can bring it to us.
Absolutely. And I think that comes across in your book, the passion for history. And for me, and yeah, I can imagine that you have so many more stories to share in multiple volumes.
Well, yeah, even just think about sports. The sports market is huge, and people collecting baseball cards, and that's a little bit different, because you don't find people collecting sports people who are baseball collectors, I think for the most part, going back and collecting sports from the 17th century. Rather than, gain inspiration, a lot of that is built on nostalgia. You went to baseball, as I did, went to baseball games with your dad. You played baseball as a kid. The sport has given you a lot, and you collect that. It's a little bit different than the document world. I was just kind of thinking that through, because the sports market is just so big. But listen, talk about subjective, talk about emotional. Nostalgia is a strong driver of a very large industry. The sports collecting market is huge, and a lot of that, not all of it, but a lot of it is based on, a nostalgic personal interaction with the game. With a game. It's a game. These are games, but they're more than that.
Absolutely. And I think that comes across in your work, is this idea of just keep exploring and keep connecting. And that really comes across in this, that it really is all about those connections. And I love that accordion analogy of, feeling the past in the present, and knowing that we are connected.
Look around me right now. In the room I'm in is a quotation by Ralph Waldo Emerson. There is my great grandfather's deed to a plot of land in Iowa in the 1850s, which he bought with money that he made at the gold rush. Here's my namesake, Nathan Leibowitz's he's my great grandfather, his naturalization papers when he entered the United States at the turn of the previous century. You get a small taste of, what I'm thinking about when I'm in this room.
I love it. And for Presidency's listeners, I've talked about my library of presidential books that I use for research, and this is a place that I come to. And like you were saying, Nate, it's a place that I feel that connection. I feel that connection with something that I'm passionate about, and something that is very deep rooted in who I am.
Yeah, it makes our lives more fulfilling.
Absolutely.
It's It's a small way in which we get to mold the environment around us in a way which contributes to our daily lives.
Absolutely. Having those connections with things that matter to us.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's why we're in business, is that people feel this attachment to history. If people stopped tomorrow, woke up and decided we didn't care about history, well, or that, the Napoleons of the world or the Jeffersons or Lincolns ceased to inspire us, we ceased to care about what they did, well, I'll have to join the podcasting world or something because I won't be selling documents. I don't expect that to happen, but knock on wood. But no, I find the interest in these great figures is strong, and the market continues to demonstrate that with continually increasing prices. But we're always out there pounding the pavement, waiting for the next exciting discovery to come our way. And we look at anywhere from 10 to 30 documents every single day that are coming from around the world to us. People saying, "Do you want to buy this? What do you think of this?" I mean, I probably have 3 or 4 just to come in just in the time that we've been doing this podcast. And you never know. I mean, 99% of those things are either not going to be for us. They're not going to be important. They're not going to be what we carry. Maybe they're copies or forgeries. Sifting through all that to get to the 1 or 2 pieces that, are truly exciting, like this Einstein piece that we're looking at, is, that's the hard work.
Yeah, and your passion for it comes through. Although, if you ever decide to do a podcast, please reach out. I'm more than glad to offer what 2 cents I can.
I was being facetious. I don't expect that to happen. I'll leave the podcasting to the professionals like you.
Well, Nate, as we wrap up, I was wondering, what would you say is the greatest lesson you've learned in your career to date, and what keeps you excited about the work that you do?
Greatest lesson. I'm going to take that broadly. I think humility is a good life lesson, and that applies sort of to everything, marketing efforts, all the way to, respect the documents, respect what you're working with, have humility about your own knowledge, the extent of it, where you need to add to it, where you're sufficient. Humility is a good lesson, I think, in life in general, and I think more people could learn it. Looking at everything with a fresh eye, not assuming because someone else said it was authentic, it is authentic. I don't know. Honestly, I feel like I'm learning something new every single day, which is the gift of this. I mean, sometimes it can be hectic and a little frantic, but the gift of this is that, I get to learn. Like, I didn't know, for instance, that when they couldn't accomplish the telegraph communication directly, they used flags and torches. I mean, I had no idea, but I learned that today. So now I know that. That's the lesson that I learned today, is that they did that. I also learned, by the way, that Einstein frequently taught lectures at the university in Berlin on the subject of relativity, which is not something that I knew. I should have known it. I knew he was a professor, and I knew that was his subject. So it seemed logical, but I guess I just never put 2 and 2 together. I pictured him as a researcher, but in fact, he was a professor, a role he later reprised at Princeton. And the second question, probably get so into these first questions, then I can't remember the second question. What's the second question?
No worries. So what keeps you excited about the work that you do?
The new stuff, the things that I don't even know are out there, popping in and saying, "Hey, here we are. No one's seen us in 200, 300 years." Getting new packages in the mail is always exciting. You never exactly know what you're getting. You always have a sense, right? But like, what's on the back? What does it feel like? It's different seeing an image of it than like physically touching it. So that, feeling like what we do is different and special. I mean, you may go the rest of your life without, having as long a conversation with a historical document dealer and expert as you just had with me. There's only a handful of us out there. It's not, there's no school. There's no you can't go to the program they have at Harvard or Caltech or Stanford or, Northwestern. I mean, there's no school for this. You have to come up the way I came up. It's just how it is. So, there's a certain, I'll temper my humility with a certain sense of pride that we're doing something different, and then come back to the humility, because I don't want to keep the humility, but not too much humility.
Absolutely. Well, and it's one of those things, being on the front lines of doing something that is unique. It is, you don't have as much of the guide rails, and there's so much more that you can learn when you're doing something like that. And so it's fascinating. I know it was a fascinating read for me. I know for our listeners, I highly recommend picking up the book. The book is The Hunt for History: On the Trail of the World's Lost Treasures, from the letters of Lincoln, Churchill, and Einstein to the secret recordings on board JFK's Air Force One. And if one of those things, and I know for our listeners, quite a few of those things are going to really catch your attention, please check it out. There are so many fascinating stories that you include in your work, Nate, and I look forward to future works from you to be able to hear more about what you're finding and what's in the next mailing that comes to you and the next document that you're going to discover that could completely reshape how we look at history. So thank you so much for this fascinating conversation, and thank you so much for what you do.
Well, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed the conversation. It's always fun to talk about these things.
Special thanks to Nathan Raab, president of the Raab Collection and author of The Hunt for History: On the Trail of the World's Lost Treasures, from the letters of Lincoln, Churchill, and Einstein to the secret recordings on board JFK's Air Force One, for a fantastic conversation. Thanks again to Rebecca Berry for her work in setting up this discussion. I'll have a link to the book where you can find out more about Nate and the work of the Raab Collection on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. There, you can also find past episodes of the podcast, links to resources on all of the U.S. presidents, and information on how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help support the work of the Presidency's podcast. If you'd like to reach out to me with any questions or comments, please feel free to send me an email at presidenciespodcast, that's all one word, @gmail.com. You can also connect with me on social media if you haven't already. I can be found on Facebook, Blue Sky, and Mastodon as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. As always, I thank you so much for listening. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
Hello, this is Gary Chahot welcoming you to check out the French History Podcast. Our main show covers the history of France from the first humans until present. If you liked Mike Duncan's The History of Rome and wanted a similar program covering the land of beauty, culture, and love, we are exactly that. We also host world-renowned scholars who have delivered guest episodes on their specialties, including 18th century pirates, revolutionary booksellers in 20th century Paris, the special friendship between the Marquis de Lafayette and Thomas Jefferson, and numerous others. Learn what you love and listen to the French History Podcast today.